Far from the chaotic hum of central Dublin, on the scenic north coast of the county lies the picture-perfect village of Malahide, an enclave of wealth and history. It draws thousands of day-tripping Dubliners out from the city to walk on the golden sands of its estuary, to peruse the cafes, restaurants and boutiques, to stroll in the grounds of its 800-year-old castle, and to admire the luxury yachts and motor cruisers that bop gently up and down in the exclusive marina. As idyllic as this charming settlement is on the surface, all is not what it seems. Malahide has a dark and bloody story to tell, one that you will not find mention of on any tourist trail or guide. On the outskirts of the village, where the Dublin and Swords roads converge, there once stood a house by the name of Mancha. Here, 100 years ago, the largest mass murder in the history of this state was discovered on the morning of the 31st of March, 1926, when the civic guard rushed to the scene of the burning house that morning and frantically attempted to gain entry through the shuttered and barred windows. They called out to the occupants of the house to urge them to leave, yet bizarrely, no cries for help were heard from either the McDonnell family or their two servants, James and Mary, whom they knew to be inside. Soon a scene of sheer horror was presented to all who gathered to witness the fire at La Mancha, as 6 bodies, 4 of them charred almost beyond recognition, were laid out on its manicured lawn. An entire family unit had been decimated: Peter, Joseph, Anne and Alice McDonald, and also their 2 servants, Mary McGowan and James Clark. Among the shocked crowd stood Henry McCabe, a gardener employed by the Macdonalds, who had worked at La Mancha for 20 years and who was the sole survivor of the tragedy. As he stood in the crowd and watched the scene unfold, he lit a cigarette and shifted uncomfortably in his ill-fitting trousers. Henry was the one who had run frantically to the guards to alert them of the fire. Yet now all sense of urgency seemed to have faded away, and to the surprise of those present, he showed little emotion at the sight of the blackened bodies. What seemed at first like a tragic accident soon turned into a dramatic murder investigation, as evidence of brutal violence and arsenic poisoning were uncovered, and it became apparent that all 6 victims had lain dead in La Mancha before the fire had begun to rip through the house. Henry McCabe, the only person known to have been at the house on the previous days, was placed under arrest and charged with murder. At the sensational court case that followed, he was found guilty of the murder of the McDonnell family and their servants, and was duly hanged for his crimes at Mountjoy jail, as a group of supporters, led by his wife, prayed for a last-minute reprieve outside the gates. Was this quiet, diminutive and well-liked gardener, who had worked diligently for the family, really capable of first poisoning and then beating to death 6 people, driven only by a motive of theft, making him the largest mass murderer in the history of the state? Or was there another culprit, much closer to home, who had slaughtered the victims and then done the same to themselves? This is the story of the massacre of the McDonnell family of Malahide and their servants, Mary McGowan and James Clark, of the hanging of Henry McCabe, and of how this story, that was the most sensational murder case of its day, slipped into obscurity. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. These videos take weeks to research, write, film on location, narrate and edit. Your likes, comments and shares enable the video to reach a wider audience, and it will help me to continue on my mission to bring back to life the lesser known stories and characters from Ireland's long history. You can also find the Obscure Ireland with Peter podcast on Spotify, Apple and wherever you listen to your podcasts. In 1920, an advertisement appeared in the Irish press that attracted the attention of Joseph McDonnell and his family, who at the time were living in the village of Ballygar in County Galway. The McDonnell family, consisting of Annie, Maggie, Joseph, Peter and Alice, were siblings who had been running a successful grocery business in the village for many years. The advert described a fine Georgian house named La Mancha, which stood just outside the village of Malahide in North Dublin on the far side of the country. Built in the mid-1700s, the house was surrounded by mature landscape gardens and approximately 30 acres of farmland. The Macdonalds, who were all in their 40s and early 50s and all unmarried, were a wealthy family and had recently made the surprising decision to sell their successful business and embark on a new chapter in their lives, one that would allow them to live comfortably and spend their days playing golf and cards. And Malahide, with its scenic seaside golf course, seemed like just the place they were looking for. The Macdonalds, despite the turbulence of the War of Independence, did not hesitate to purchase La Mancha and made their move to Dublin, unaware that it was the worst decision they would ever make. Together, Joseph, Maggie, Peter, Annie and Alice paid £4,500 for their new home, and it appears that they equally shared ownership of the house. La Mancha was a large country house with ample gardens and fertile North County Dublin farmland. The family knew they could not run it alone, so their loyal and trusted servant James Clark made the move to Malahide with them, where they were joined by their maid, Mary McGowan from Lusk. James and Mary both worked mainly in the house, so another servant was required to maintain the mature gardens and to work on their land. This role was dutifully fulfilled by one Mr. Henry McCabe, who by 1920 had already been working at La Mancha for over a decade and had been recommended to the family as a trusted and hard-working member of staff by the home's previous owner. Henry was a popular character in the village who lived with his wife and 9 children at Parnell Cottages on the far side of Malahide Castle estate. Small in stature, but with a strength earned by years of manual labour, Henry was a quiet man who, after a brief move to England, had returned to Malahide and found himself a job at La Mancha. Over the next 6 years, the Macdonalds settled in Malahide and by all accounts were well liked and respected by the community. Peter had joined Malahide Golf Club, and Joseph frequently attended card games in both the village and the city, a short train ride from Malahide. Annie also enjoyed their new surroundings and took part in the busy social life of the village. Alice MacDonald had always been a little on the eccentric side, and following the death of her older sister Maggie in 1924, who had been more of a mother figure to her than a sister, her behaviour became more erratic. The road outside their home was a busy thoroughfare, even in 1926, with people passing by frequently on their way to Swords or Dublin, and the low wall that surrounded the estate allowed them to peek into the gardens of La Mancha through the mature trees that lined the boundary. The sight of Alice running around the garden while screaming and shouting became the talk of the village gossips, who rather unkindly gave her the nickname of Mad Alice. Her behaviour had of late become so unpredictable that both Annie MacDonald and Mary McGowan had taken to sleeping in the same bedroom as Alice so they could keep an eye on her at night. Exactly what was wrong with Alice is unknown, but soon her strange behaviour would lead to the sanity of other members of the household being brought into question. By the end of 1925, the family had begun to consider another move, perhaps spurred by the death of their sister Margaret, and were actively looking for a home to purchase in Dublin City. But fate had other plans for the Macdonalds. On Tuesday evening, the 30th of March 1926, Henry McCabe attended a wake in Malahide village, where he stayed until 8 a.m. the following morning. From the grieving household, he then made his way straight to work at La Mancha. It was now Wednesday, the 31st of March, and Henry arrived at the McDonnell home at 8:30 a.m. The small lodge at the entrance to the house was occupied by James Riley and his wife. James had left for work at 7:30 a.m. and had noticed nothing amiss at the larger house. Shortly before Henry's arrival, Mrs. Riley had also left the lodge to make her way to Mass. She too noticed nothing unusual that morning. That was until she heard panicked footsteps racing up behind her. She turned around and came face to face with Henry McCabe, who told her that he had just seen smoke rising from La Mancha and that the kitchen door at the rear of the house appeared to have been kicked in. Henry took off at speed, and moments later he arrived at Malahide Civic Guard Station to raise the alarm. The Civic Guards responded immediately. 3 of them, led by Sergeant Kenny, grabbed their bicycles and raced to La Mancha, while Henry followed close behind. A crowd of local men who had been making their way to work had already gathered at the house, and together with the guards, they frantically tried to gain access to the house as smoke billowed out from the roof. Their efforts were severely hampered by the fact that almost all of the windows were shuttered and locked from the inside, while the lower basement windows were barred. Sergeant Kenny pounded on the front door and rang the bell repeatedly in a desperate attempt to alert the occupants to the fire. When his calls went unanswered, he took a sledgehammer and smashed through a window and the locked shutters behind, but was pushed back by the flames. He turned to Henry McCabe and asked him where the bedrooms were. Henry, whose initial panic seemed to have faded, was now standing in the crowd doing little to help, pointed to an upper level window. A ladder was fetched and Sergeant Kenny climbed to the first floor, smashed another window and shutter, and this time gained entry to the room that to his dismay he found to be empty. Meanwhile, Daniel McCann, a local man from Kinseely Lane who had been checking the basement level windows, spotted a body lying on the floor inside. The bars were forced apart and the window smashed, allowing the guards to gain entry, where they found an unresponsive James Clark, apparently untouched by the fire. James lay on the ground in his underwear, with a ghastly injury visible on the side of his skull, from which brain matter had protruded. The first body was removed from La Mancha and laid out on the lawn in front of the house for everyone to see. On hearing the commotion, Henry rushed around from the rear of the house to see the dead body of his co-worker and his horrifically shattered skull. He was heard to exclaim,
"Was it a thing you could be murdered?"
He let out a cry and, with froth coming from his mouth, ran from where James's body lay. At 8:57 a.m, news that La Mancha was in flames reached Tara Street Fire Station. The brigade, under the command of Lieutenant Power, turned out a fire engine and a hand pump and rushed at breakneck speed out of the city and along the country roads that led to Malahide. Power would later tell reporters that they reached the scene of the fire in an astounding 12 minutes. News had also reached the top brass of the Civic Guard, and as the fire brigade arrived on the scene, so too did General Owen O'Duffy, Chief Commissioner of the Police. The fire brigade laid down 2 lines of hose, drawing water from a pond across the road, and gallantly attempted to save La Mancha and its occupants. But by now the fire had truly taken hold, and the crowd watched in despair as the roof collapsed into the bedrooms on the upper floor. The fire was finally extinguished by 1 p.m, and by then all hope of finding anyone alive in the house had evaporated. The grim task of recovering bodies fell to the fire brigade. They climbed through an upstairs window and carefully searched through what remained of one of the bedrooms, where they found and recovered 3 severely charred bodies. The remains of Annie and Alice McDonnell and Mary McGowan, so badly burnt that one of the women's legs were missing and their faces disfigured almost beyond recognition, were laid on the lawn next to James Clark. In the sitting room downstairs, the naked body of Peter McDonnell lay on the ground. Just like James Clark, he appeared to have been untouched by the flames, yet multiple injuries were visible to his head. Nearby was found a fire poker with what appeared to be brain matter at one end, and despite the smoke, a strong smell of paraffin was present throughout the house. Finally, the burnt and almost unrecognisable body of Joseph McDonnell was discovered in his bedroom. As the final embers of La Mancha were extinguished, 6 bodies lay between the carnations and golden privet of the Macdonalds' manicured front garden. An entire family unit and 2 of their loyal servants had been wiped out, and all that remained of their home was a smouldering shell. The guards were presented with a baffling scene that was to cause intense speculation as they began their investigation. What initially seemed like a terrible accident almost immediately became a murder investigation. James Clark had clearly been the victim of a brutal assault. His forearms bore the marks of defensive wounds, showing he had tried to fight off his attacker before his skull was caved in. Before the fire had fully taken hold, Henry McCabe had led the guards to the rear kitchen door to show them that it had been forced open. On the ground just inside the door lay a container of paraffin and a candle, and the fire brigade could clearly see that multiple fires had been lit throughout the house. The guards first turned their attention to Peter McDonnell, who was found lying naked in the sitting room. Had he suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown, beaten James Clark to death with a poker, then done the same to his sisters, brother and Mary, then set the house on fire before somehow taking his own life? If so, how had he, a slight man in his mid-50s, unaccustomed to physical labour, been able to overpower James, who was tall, powerfully built, and 10 years younger than him? The only person it seemed who could shed any light on the mystery was Henry McCabe, who had apparently had a miraculous escape from death. James Clark had been away from the house since the previous Saturday, and typically the Macdonalds requested that Henry stay in the house in his absence. Yet, on that fateful night, they had not asked him to do so. James Clark, it seemed, had the misfortune to only arrive back at La Mancha late on Tuesday night. Newspaper reporters took a keen interest in Henry McCabe, as by his own admission, he had been the last person to see the Macdonalds alive, and he gave multiple interviews on the afternoon following the fire.
The last member of the family I saw alive was Joseph. That was at 8 p.m. on Tuesday. I saw none of the others since Monday, when Miss Annie came out to the yard and asked me to kill a chicken, also mentioning that she intended going to Dublin. She became ill in the yard and vomited. Later I learned that Mary McGowan, the servant, got sick while washing and also had to go to bed. I did not see either Peter or Miss Alice that day. Joseph said they were all sick. On Tuesday he was the only one I met. He called me in for my dinner and tea. The meals were ready when I went in, but I do not know who prepared them. Before I left at 8 o'clock, Joseph told me to look out for Clark's return, and if he did not arrive, to come in earlier in the morning to milk. I then left the house and attended a wake in the town. On leaving it at 8 a.m. today, I immediately proceeded to La Mancha. I saw smoke issuing from the house, and on going to the rear, I found the wicker gate open. The outside kitchen door was also open, and the inner door appears to have been broken in. The place was in flames, and I ran back to the roadway and overtook Mrs. Riley, who occupied the gate lodge. She knew nothing of what had occurred until I told her. I then raised the alarm, and the civic guard were quickly on the scene.
As to how the house had caught fire and who had attacked James Clark, Henry was unable to provide any explanation. Both civic guards and journalists initially believed that the culprit had been one of the household, most likely Peter McDonnell, who had taken advantage of the absence of Henry that night to carry out the shocking attack. This theory was widely published in newspaper articles and understandably caused much upset for relatives of the Macdonalds, and many people came forward to defend the family and stated that the brothers and sisters lived together in peace and harmony and were among the most inoffensive people to live in Malahide. Later that day, the bodies were removed to Malahide, and on April 1st, an inquest began in Hogan's public house in an effort to officially identify the victims and to investigate the circumstances of their death. The coroner advised the jury that the tragedy at La Mancha was now to be considered a matter of murder and arson, and that the evidence presented to them
will reveal the most shocking and appalling tragedy that has occurred in the district and perhaps in the country in living memory, and I am aware of no parallel.
Following some difficulties caused by the poor condition of the bodies, all 6 victims were officially identified by friends and relatives, and the coroner ordered that a post-mortem should be carried out without hesitation. The civic guard informed the court that soon important evidence would be forthcoming as their investigation continued. The inquest was then adjourned, as it would be several more times, and was not completed until June. Following the inquest, Henry McCabe made his way down to the civic guard barracks to be interviewed as a witness to the tragedy. At this early stage, their suspicion was already beginning to shift to the gardener, largely due to his strange behaviour on the day of the fire. Henry recounted the same story he had told the newspaper. During the interview conducted by Superintendent O'Halloran, he spoke of Alice Macdonald's hysteric behaviour and how she had been nicknamed Mad Alice. He also stated that Peter McDonnell had been acting very strangely, at times behaving like a schoolboy and throwing himself to the ground as if in a tantrum, while Joseph was an abnormal recluse who refused to speak to anyone, even when they sat down for meals. Superintendent O'Halloran knew the Macdonalds and had already spoken to other witnesses who had told him that Peter and Joseph had been perfectly well the last time they had been seen. Following the interview that revealed little of significance, O'Halloran accompanied Henry to the remains of La Mancha, and he showed the superintendent where the kitchen door had been kicked in at the rear of the house. The two men began to look around the house separately, and after a few minutes, Henry returned to the superintendent and showed him a set of keys he claimed to have just found in the pocket of a pair of trousers in Peter McDonnell's room. O'Halloran examined the keys and brought them over to the safe. To his surprise, one of them fit. He opened the safe to find that it contained only a few papers relating to insurance policies. Henry asked the policeman,
"Have you opened it? Is there any money in it?"
Pointing to a thick compartment on the door, he said,
"Surely there must be money in that."
The absence of money from the safe was unusual, as everybody knew that the Macdonalds were a wealthy family. Annie and Alice both owned jewellery, and Peter and Joseph wore gold watches, and the family had always kept their money in a safe rather than a bank account, yet the money and jewellery were nowhere to be seen. The superintendent pondered to himself for a moment. How had Henry, a gardener, who likely never ventured further into the house than the kitchen in the basement, known where Peter's bedroom was? And had he really just discovered the keys as he had claimed? He looked Henry up and down, taking note of the fine pair of tweed trousers he was wearing, the same pair he had worn the day before, and how they looked like they belonged to a suit. He examined the keys he now held in his hand, that bore no sign of having survived a fire. Had the keys been in Henry's possession for longer than he claimed? A later search of the house found the remains of a tweed suit in Peter McDonnell's wardrobe, except the trousers were missing. Why on earth was Henry McCabe wearing Peter McDonnell's clothes? And why had he been implying that Joseph and Peter had been acting so strangely? Henry was questioned again multiple times over the week. During an interview with Chief Superintendent Leahy, he spoke of how he and James Clark had found out from a neighbour that La Mancha had been put up for sale, and how James had been acting strangely ever since. It appeared to the guards that Henry was trying to create a narrative that shifted potential blame away from himself. Could the sale of La Mancha been a motive for this horrific crime? In the case of Henry McCabe, it seems unlikely, as he had been working on the estate for 20 years and would have been confident that any new owners would continue his employment, as they had done several times before. Did this apparently law-abiding family man, who worked hard for a living and handed his 35-shilling wages over to his wife every Saturday evening, keeping only a shilling for himself to purchase cigarettes and the occasional pint, really have the resolve and intelligence required to carry out an act of extreme violence and then carefully and calmly cover his tracks? The guards now firmly believed that he was the culprit, and on the 12th of April 1926, Henry McCabe was placed under arrest. As Henry sat in the station after his arrest, Civic Guard Hayden, an orderly at the station, asked him how he was, to which Henry replied,
"It's all up with me now. I am going to Mountjoy in the morning, and it is all because of the pants I have on me. Can I go out to tell me wife that I got the pants some time ago on a parcel that the Macdonalds sent me?"
The post-mortem carried out by Dr. Groves seemed to confirm the guard's suspicions. While 3 of the bodies were too badly burnt to fully confirm their cause of death, It was clear that the others had died from injuries inflicted on their skulls during a vicious assault, and as no soot was present in their lungs, had been dead long before any fire had broken out. James Clark, the doctor believed, had been the first victim and may even have been dead for up to 3 days before the fire. Samples were taken from the bodies and stored in jars, which were later retested when a new theory emerged. The tests revealed the presence of arsenic. This discovery led to a grim scene at 2 local graveyards when the bodies of the Macdonalds and that of Mary McGowan were exhumed to retrieve further samples that confirmed the presence of the poison. The revelation reminded the guards of Henry McCabe's statements that the family had all been feeling ill in the days leading up to the fire. Was it possible that he had poisoned them himself, leaving them in a weakened and vulnerable state? Despite all their theories, they had little physical evidence to prove that Henry McCabe was the killer. After all, the Macdonalds could have been the victim of a violent robbery carried out by a person or persons unknown who simply saw the well-to-do and gentle family as an easy target. Henry was imprisoned in Mountjoy, and as he awaited his trial, was repeatedly questioned by the investigating guards, who, concerned at the lack of physical evidence, were keen to convince Henry to confess. Throughout the process, he always maintained his innocence, however.
Malahide Mystery. Trial opened at Central Criminal Court today. The trial opened at the Central Criminal Court today of Henry McCabe, charged with the murder of Peter, Alice, Joseph and Annie McDonnell, Mary McGowan and James Clark, at La Mancha, Malahide, in March last. Much public interest was manifested in the case, and the court galleries were crowded. A conspicuous object on the solicitor's table was a large plaster and wood model of La Mancha, with removable roof, which showed the interior disposition of the destroyed premises prior to the burning. The prisoner, a low-sized man with grey hair, pleaded not guilty.
The trial of Henry McCabe, presided over by Mr. Justice John O'Byrne, was to last 6 days, during which 60 witnesses were called, including civic guards, firemen, doctors, and many members of the public who had been in contact with the Macdonalds or McCabe at the end of March. Each day of the trial drew large crowds who packed out the public gallery and the street outside the courthouse. As there was little physical evidence to present, the prosecution needed to prove to the jury that Henry McCabe was the only person who could possibly have committed the crime. They spoke of his strange behaviour on the morning of the fire, how rather than trying to save his employers and colleagues himself, he had stood back as an observer, smoking a cigarette, and seemed almost detached from what was happening. The prosecution alleged that Henry, taking advantage of the absence of James Clark, had used his access to the kitchen to somehow add poison to the family's food, with a view to weakening them or killing them so he could rob the contents of their safe. Perhaps James Clark had returned to the house unexpectedly and had found Henry in the process of robbing the safe, and this was the reason he had been attacked. If Henry attacked James and the 5 other victims, his clothing surely must have been covered in their blood, and it would have been necessary for him to change. This was the reason they implied that on the morning of the fire and the day after, Henry was seen to be wearing a clean pair of tweed trousers and not his usual work clothes. Also, during a search of the house after the fire, multiple piles of clothing were discovered, some of which had been burned while others were doused in paraffin and had apparently been removed from the victims to hide evidence of the bloody assault they had suffered. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence was that of the set of keys Henry claimed to have found in Peter's bedroom. Henry recounted a conversation with Superintendent O'Halloran, who he claimed had asked him to go upstairs and search the room for keys. Yet the superintendent gave evidence that this conversation never took place, and that Henry most likely was already in possession of the keys, as they showed no sign of having been burnt. The defence would argue that the person responsible for the killings was not Henry McCabe or some other unknown individual, but one of the McDonnell brothers themselves, who had lost their mind and murdered James Clark causing Annie and Alice to become hysterical, and then murdered everyone in the house before setting the fire and taking their own life. Henry did little to help his own defence, as when he was questioned, he stumbled and contradicted himself on multiple occasions, and even admitted that the Macdonalds were sound of mind at the time of the killing, thus scuttling his own defence. The prosecution closed their case by describing Henry as an arch criminal, yet the performance he had given in court suggested that rather than an arch criminal, he was instead a rather simple man who could not remember the details of his previous statements and continuously contradicted himself.
Guilty, says jury. Prisoner's outburst from dock. Murder drama ends. Final scenes in most memorable trial in century. The 6-day trial arising out of the 6-fold murder at Malahide in March last concluded last night in the Central Criminal Court at Green Street. The accused man, Henry McCabe, formerly a gardener at Mancha, was found guilty and sentenced to death. In a tense voice, the prisoner said,
"All I have to say is, God forgive them. I am the victim of bribery and perjury."
Mr. A. Lynn, BL, in his speech for the defence, said that McCabe was in the dock through an extraordinary accident, that he was working for his living in the house in which all the people met their death in some form or other. No matter which of the victims had survived, he or she, according to the methods of the police, would have been charged with the murder. According to the prosecution, this bold, clever, intellectual criminal McCabe allowed to pass all the opportunities of the disturbed times to get the loot that was supposed to be in the house. At the very outset of the case, the prosecution were driven to a terrible dilemma. McCabe, said Mr. Lynn, knew that the Macdonalds were murdered. He did not report it to the police, and therefore, according to the inexorable logic of the prosecution, he murdered the Macdonalds. But I suggest, as the same type of logic, that the Macdonalds knew that Clark was dead. They did not report it to the police. Therefore, the Macdonalds murdered Clark. The jury had taken only 50 minutes to find Henry McCabe guilty of murder, yet there were many people who believed him to be an innocent man. His wife never doubted him, and almost as soon as the verdict was read, began a campaign to have his death sentence commuted. Many people in Malahide found it impossible to believe that this quiet, hard-working family man was capable of committing such an act of extreme violence. An appeal was lodged to the courts, along with a petition containing hundreds of signatures, but it was all to no avail. The hanging was to go ahead, and the state wasted no time in contracting the services of renowned English executioner Thomas Pierpoint to carry out the sentence.
The last act in the grim tragedy of La Mancha was staged yesterday morning, when in Mountjoy Prison, Henry McCabe, the Malahide gardener, expiated his crime. He was hanged at 8 a.m. by Pierpoint, who was assisted by Robinson. A crowd of between 200 and 300 assembled outside the prison, the majority being women, some of whom had been there as early as 7 a.m. At 8 o'clock, the enclosure outside the prison gate was densely packed, and a woman began to recite the rosary, the responses being given by the crowd. A few minutes before 8, Mrs. McCabe with some relatives arrived and remained there with rosary beads between her fingers, praying silently. Shortly after 8, a warder appeared from inside the prison and posted on the gate a typewritten notice signed by the governor, announcing that the sentence of the law had been carried out. Mrs. McCabe, on seeing the notice, wept bitterly, and some women who accompanied her also gave way to tears.
In his last moments, McCabe was attended by the prison chaplains, Reverend M. McMahon and Reverend Dr. Fitzpatrick. An inquest held later in the prison by Dr. Louis A. Byrne, City Coroner, Mr. A. F. Faulkner, Governor, identified the remains and said the execution was carried out without a hitch. Dr. Hackett, prison M.O., said that death was instantaneous. In April 1926, 4 siblings were laid to rest with their older sister in a small graveyard between the village of Malahide and the shell of a fine Georgian home named La Mancha. Mary McGowan was buried with her family in the nearby village of Lusk, while James Clark made one final journey to his native Galway. Despite being separated by death, the McDonnell headstone bears the names of Mary and James, who have become more like family than servants to the siblings. The killing of 6 people in Malahide in 1926 remains to this day the largest mass murder outside of political violence in the history of the Irish state. La Mancha was demolished following the fire, and over time its lands were developed into housing estates. On the corner of the Dublin and Swords Road, this shop stands in the former gardens of the home, where the bodies of the 6 unfortunate victims were laid out a century ago. The only trace that remains of La Mancha is an ornamental mound that formed part of its gardens in the Ardnamara estate, a housing development built on the McDonnell farmland, and the low wall that once surrounded the gardens on the Dublin and Swords roads. Do you think Henry McCabe was really capable of carrying out such a heinous crime? Was this apparently quiet, hard-working family man harbouring a dark and ruthless desire for money and murder that even his family and friends were unaware of? Or did his conviction, based on circumstantial evidence, allow the real killer or killers to go unpunished? As always, let me know what you think in the comment section below.